Received his doctorate of osteopathy.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Presently Director of Pediatric Pulmonary and Critical Care Medicine at Community Medical Center. Dr. Smith moved to Missoula 5 years ago from Cleveland, Ohio, where he completed his Pediatric Pulmonary and Critical Care Fellowship at Case Western Reserve University Hospitals and Rainbow Babies and Children's Hospitals in 1991. He remained at Case Western as Associate Professor of Pediatrics, plus served as Director of Pediatric Critical Care at Metro Health Hospital. Currently, through the University of Montana, Dr. Smith researches wood smoke exposure and how it relates to respiratory tract diseases in Native Americans. At the end of Dr. Smith's presentation, there will be an opportunity for questions, and we will come around with the microphone for those questions, just so that our participants at the remote sites can also hear your questions. So please help me welcome Dr. Paul Smith.
Is the microphone on too loud or too soft? If it's too loud, raise your hand. I hate sitting in an audience where the speaker doesn't know what he's doing as far as your earphones go. So, I'd like to thank you for the chance to come over and talk about this. It's an area that I've gotten an interest in and been involved in, again, through research through the University of Montana and what smoke is doing to children's lungs in particular. And I've got to say, every time I put together a talk like this, it's very hard for me because it's such a voluminous field as far as air pollution is doing to our health that it's really hard to restrict it. So I'm trying to restrict today's talk specifically to what particulate matter does to children's health and narrow it down that far. I'm sure we're all very interested in what air pollution is doing to our lungs. I'm sure that it's a topic that's important to most of us, but I don't think most of the public realizes really the scope of the problem. The World Health Organization estimates that we lose about 3 million people a year directly because of the effects of air pollution. And of course, in the state of Montana, it's important to us because we are subject to forest fire smoke. The months of August and September are hell for us over here. And that's where we get dinged as far as American Lung Association is because of the short period of time of particulate matter that comes over to us from the western states and the worst problems that we have with smoke around here are not because of the things that we suffer within the city limits, although certainly our problems are exacerbated by the geometry here and the inversion layers, and also as our days are getting longer and hotter, and our forest fire seasons are actually getting more intense and lengthier from year to year. So it's a big issue for us locally. The things that I want to talk about today, I'll go through a short period of talking about the history of air pollution because I think it's fascinating, and the older I get, the more I enjoy history. We'll talk about what exactly particulate matter is and then how it affects children, what the pathophysiology is, various diseases that kids are specifically subject to, and then what we can do as a group of health professionals. Really, the history of air pollution probably goes back for as long as men have been getting together and doing things. And interestingly, if you look at ice core samples from Greenland and the Arctic that go down as far as over 100,000 years, there's a spike in methane and particulate matter that happens about 2,000 years ago when we were starting to get into metallurgy and domestication of animals. You can find evidence of anthroposis in mummy monks from Egypt 5,000 years ago. Certainly the Romans and British have put up with air pollution for millennia. But really, I think some of the closest parallels that look at the history of air pollution and lung health go back through London. And as early as the late 1200s, when they were running out of wood, they started burning sea coal. And it didn't take long until the inhabitants of London got upset about it, and the king passed laws against burning the sea coal. And the first air polluter that was ever prosecuted was executed for burning sea coal in 1306. And on into later centuries, Richard III and Henry V also passed laws against burning sea coal. Didn't seem to change much, and so even with Shakespeare in the 1600s and the great diarist John Evelyn, they described the severity of the air pollution that they were dealing with at the time. Interestingly, it wasn't really until the 1700s that we understood what lungs were for. Before that, we really thought that they were just a ventilating unit, that they cured some of the evil humors that maybe trickled down from the brain. It was James Priestley that, that's that one, really was the first one to describe oxygen, or was credited with the discovery of oxygen. He found that when you heated mercury oxide or subjected it to sun, oxygen came off, and it would sustain life longer than just plain air. Interestingly, he showed those experiments to the guy on the other side of the screen, Antoine Lavoisier. And Antoine Lavoisier was credited with actually figuring out what oxygen did some of the first studies on oxygen consumption with exercise. He noted that oxygen consumption would go up the more active that you were. Kind of an interesting sideline of history, Priestley was such a activist and so interested in trying to combine science and religion that even though he was a clergyman, he got getting moved from city to city in England. He eventually was such a proponent for the French Revolution that they burned his house down and he had to flee to the United States. Kind of as a sideline, Lavoisier ended up getting beheaded in the French Revolution, so be careful which side you're on, I guess. But about that time was when the Industrial Revolution really took off with the advent of textile mills and forging metal and the increased use of coal in England. And then things really took off, and there got to be increased instances of mass periods of time when smog was so great that they would have an increased number of deaths. They tried to pass a Public Abatement Act in 1875, and really what they did was recommend just making the chimneys higher. But there were 4 months of sunlessness in 1879. Find these pictures by Monet of interest. The top one is the Bridge of Waterloo, and that's actually one of a series of several dozen pictures that he tried to paint of that bridge. And he was always very frustrated because he could never get a clear shot. You can see the chimneys in the background and the smog kind of obscuring it. He has a similar group of paintings of the Bay of Havre outside of his window in France. It was the same thing. You can see the chimneys and the smog in the background. Or as we say here in Montana, Lee Havre, right? Things really did not improve much across the years in London. And there were periods of time when you would basically have traffic stalled. The theaters would have to be canceled because the actors couldn't breathe during the productions. There was a Smoke Abatement Act in 1926. There was the Great London Smog in 1952, which they attributed over 2,000 deaths within the city to that. And they passed their first True Clean Air Act in the late 1950s. The United States, obviously, the history of smog and pollution is somewhat shorter because we weren't here quite so long, but there were actually Clean Air Acts passed in the cities of Chicago and Cincinnati back in the 1800s because the population was very tired of foundries dirtying their laundry, basically. And we here in Montana have a very interesting history with Anaconda and the copper smelting mills. And I haven't found a copy of this book, but I would love to get it. It's I'll get that from you. It's kind of the politics of what happened when they opened up smelters close to Anaconda. And the world's largest smelter at the time was outside of Deer Lodge. That smelter is still causing us problems, basically. I found this quote interesting, and I think it really reflects on still kind of what the attitudes are. We have the perfect right to carry out a legitimate business if incidentally we should pollute the atmosphere, and no one has the right to complain until specific damage gives them a cause of action. And I think that's still kind of the attitude, is that if we have something we don't like as far as what our environment goes, we have to prove that it harms us instead of the opposite, that you have to prove that it's safe to us before you're given permission to subject us to it. There's a famous instance in Donora, Pennsylvania. The Monongahela River Valley had several still smelting factories there, and there was an unusual inversion layer there that lasted about a week and killed probably 20 people immediately and another 50 over the next month. And it was interesting to read accounts of that. They had oxygen in oxygen tanks, and the sheriff was running out of oxygen, so they had to bring oxygen in from other counties. He said that instead of taking oxygen himself, when he would get back to his base, he would just take another shot of whiskey. Los Angeles started having problems in the 40s, again with automobile increases, and also with the formation of foundries and factories actually within the city. There were 20 days of heavy smog where people were complaining of ion throat irritation that had to do with the formation of a butadiene factory right in the city limits. And that was an important chemical for making rubber. And then this guy came along, who's a very interesting man. He's Andre Jan Hingensmith. I'm no relation to him. But he worked on pineapples and what made pineapples taste good, and figured out micro methods of actually getting the vapors off the pineapples. And then his pineapples started dying, and he thought it was because of the smog. And nobody really knew what the smog in LA came from. And so he used the same methods to concentrate the air, and then discovered that it was sunlight working on automobile emissions that were the major cause for smog around LA. Interestingly, he went on to be appointed by Reagan to the Traffic Control Board and Air Clean Board in 1968, but was fired by Reagan in 1973 for refusing to lower the standards. Then in the 60s, several big events happened. A lot of people credit Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, with a change in our attitude and really a refocusing that we needed to pay attention to our environment. And about then, what used to be the National Tuberculosis Association is now American Lung Society, or American Lung Association, was having less and less trouble with tuberculosis, and so expanded their interest into air pollution and decided that they needed to maybe look at this problem in the 60s. And so had a conference in the late 60s and came up with some recommendations for what we should do with particulate matter and safe limits. Realized there was very little true human research that went on at that period of time. And so they came out with recommendations, and this number of 260 micrograms per meter squared in the 60s will kind of relate to what we think of as safe levels now, but it's tremendously high. And it wasn't until 1970 that we passed the most recent or the broadest aspect of the Clean Air Act. And the Clean Air Act really, in essence, gave the Environmental Protection Agency purview to determine what the national ambient air quality standards would be. And they picked basically 6 gases, and that sort of started a series of controversial run-ins with American Lung Association, where American Lung Association was trying to drive numbers lower and lower, and the EPA would sort of push back and keep them a little bit higher. Of all these, particulate matter is the one I picked to talk about because it's one of the easiest ones to track. It's one of the easiest ones to measure. It's one that we've done the most research on. Certainly these other gases are not healthy for you. And I think it kind of goes without saying that our attitude now is we try and find a minimal standard. Doesn't mean that any of these gases are good for your lungs. But we sort of start here in deference to industry and say, well, maybe this is safe, and those levels keep getting driven lower and lower. The first particulate matter standards were set in 1994. They've been through several iterations since then. And these are the present standards for the United States as of 2012. And they're divided into primary and secondary exposures. The primary is what we consider to be safe for public health and sensitive individuals. The secondary levels are what they consider to be safe for animals, for crops, for the general environment. And you can see that right now our primary levels for PM 2.5, and we'll talk about what these numbers mean, are 12 micrograms per meter square of air, and PM 10 is 150. We call that previous slide, it was 260 milliliters per set. Just of note also, the World Health Organization has recommended much lower levels than what we have as our standards here. So the World Health guidelines are for PM10 to be no greater than 50, and the annual of 2.5 to be 25, so lower than our 35. Just to give you some idea of what this means, you know, the original way that we used to look at this in LA was, can you see the mountains, can you not see the mountains? And try and relate that to the concentration of particulate matter within the air. And I sort of do the same things in my office that I can see out the window at a community medical center, and the M is about 3 to 5 miles. So if I can't see those, then we're already in the unhealthy range of particulate matter. And that's considered an unhealthy level for people that are sensitive by our standards. I have trouble riding a bike when it's that big out there. Kind of by the same token, if you can't see the M from here, and that's the next level up of unhealthy air. So in some ways, you can sort of understand why we have trouble with these standards. This is a really very hard area to study. Particulate matter is complex. You know, it's complex depending on where it comes from. Outdoor sources such as fires, coal, combustion, or natural sources such as dust from volcanoes. Indoor particulate matter is certainly a big problem, but that's a different composition from biomass burning for the most part. Tobacco molds, those are all particulate matter. At least worldwide, when we look at the global health impacts, the greatest impact for the world is actually indoor cooking. And that's gotten to be such a big area of concern that the World Health Organization, Bill Gates Foundation, and other groups, including the American Lung Association, are trying very hard to come up with clean cooking methods for the developing countries. Outdoor air pollution in the developing countries is probably the next most weighty, and ours is probably the least as far as indoor cooking or outdoor air pollution compared to these other countries. It's not to minimize the problems that we have, but at least as far as worldwide impact, that's where our problems are. This picture is from the Respire Study Group out of California that is looking at indoor smoking or indoor smoke exposure for women and children, and kind of depicts several things. You can obviously see the child on the back of the mom as she's bending over an open pit to do her cooking, and what high concentrations of smoke these people are exposed to. I found this picture very interesting. I don't even know if it projects very well, but in the background is the real city street scene, and people can get their pictures taken in front of this because the smoke kind of obscures it. But certainly outdoor pollution in developing countries is a huge area of concern. And then again, forest fires here in the Northwest in California are huge. And I picked this picture from 2014 simply to illustrate the wide plumes that are coming from western Washington here. There's smoke in the Bitterroot Valley, smoke from Idaho, Oregon, and just how far this stuff spreads. So hundreds of miles. And particulate matter is very complex in terms of the composition. It has inert substances like metals in it, carbon. It actually can carry biological materials, so there's some thought that you can actually catch viruses and bacteria from particulate matter. And then it's complex because for the most part we're subjected to mixtures such as diesel fuel or tobacco smoke that is composed of hundreds of chemicals for each of those. I mean, how do you study that? How do you really come up with safe limits? And then, of course, one of the more important characteristics of particulate matter is size. So if you look at a normal human hair, it's about 50 to 70 microns across. I don't think mine's that thick anymore, but PM10 is anything less than 10 microns, and you can fit 5 of those across that. And PM2.5 is anything less than 2.5 microns, and you can fit 4 across that. So that's what relative size is. And the reason that size is so important is because it determines how far down into your lungs it can get. So anything that's over about 10, for the most part, is going to get out into your nasal hairs and very little deposition within the lung tissue of the terminal bronchi. But when you get less than 10, then you have greater and greater amounts of deposition the further you are into your lungs. So that's why size is important to us. An interesting study that I ran across that nose hairs probably decreases the incidence of asthma, so it does help lower stuff out. Just plain. Again, looking at relative size, so heavy dust over 100 micrograms settles out before it gets into the air very much, so we don't worry too much about that as far as human health. Settling dust 1 to 100, and anything less than 1 micron is what you see suspended in the air for days and long periods of time. So bacteria fit within that 0.1 to 10 mold spores are in the inhalable, hat allergens, smog, tobacco smoke. You can kind of see relative sizes of those particles there. And again, it's very complex in terms of its physical makeup too. So you have a huge surface area for each particle, and the smaller the particle, the more surface area it has relatively. So if you take a gram of 10 microgram particles and compare the surface area of that to a gram of 0.1 micron particles, the surface area is huge the smaller the particle is. So how does inhalation of particulate matter cause disease? And I think that's probably one of the most important questions we as medical scientists have to keep answering for some obvious and some not so obvious reasons. Obviously, we want to know how to terminate disease and how to protect people against disease, and studying this well enough to really know what limits are safe. But we also have to maintain credibility and make sure that we go after the right targets. And I think a good illustration of that again was Higginschmidt's work in Los Angeles. You know, they were going after the wrong things when they were going after some of the factories that they thought were the major contributors. It was really, at that point in time, car smog. And so he helped develop the first emission control things for cars. So if we really want to affect public health, we have to know what it is that we're studying, how it causes the disease, and really come up with answers. And the World Health Organization has recognized this and come up with a pyramid looking at the relative weight of the studies that we have. So certainly subclinical effects are harder to study, but more numerous, and on up to symptoms, and then at the top of the pyramid, mortality, which is a small number, but certainly more convincing. The methods that we have to study this, of course, are animal studies. And I found this picture kind of interesting and ironic. So these are rats being subjected to smoke, and Lorillard in the United States has decided they're no longer going to do animal studies because they're not ethical. But anyhow, you can certainly control your studies, and you can subject an animal to very well-defined compositions and concentrations. And they're good for looking at mechanism of disease and pathophysiology, but obviously they're perhaps not as applicable in real life in terms of dose and time. We do human controlled studies in the University of Montana, and other centers have smoke exposure pits where they will take forest fire smoke that's well-defined and subject human subjects to it for short periods of time. And again, it's advantageous because you can do some dose dependency in short-term studies and look at physiologic events. It perhaps is not as clinically relevant, again, because the dose and the timing is perhaps not real life. But from those studies, we at least have come up with some pathophysiologic mechanisms. And this picture simply depicts an alveolus and alveolar air space and papillary with some nanoparticles coming into it. It depicts what a shallow interface that is between the blood and the alveolar space. You have alveolar macrophages here, terminal bronchus here. And from studies like this, we've come up with several different mechanisms whereby particulate matter can hurt your lungs. There's what's known as the classic model, where the particulate matter will land on epithelial cells, release inflammatory mediators, or stimulate macrophages that cause damage. And then there's what's called the alternative pathway, which is very interesting. And there's at least animal data showing that particulate matter can cross that barrier and directly enter the bloodstream and then settle out in other organs. And so then when particles either stimulate macrophages or translocate into the vasculature, they get transported to the lymphatic system, the blood vessels, cause airway edema, vascular reactivity, which can be shown in studies, and actually also cause immunologic changes and changes in our ability to fight off infections. There's fairly good pathophysiologic descriptions of how particulate matter can add to asthma or cause asthma. And most of the literature still hedges away from right now saying that particulate matter causes asthma. There's certainly no doubt that particulate matter increases asthma exacerbations. And there is biochemical data that release of certain mediators cause a T2 sensitization. And you may be aware that we right now theorize that a lot of asthma is because of T1, T2 imbalance in our lymphocytes. And so at least from animal studies, we can come up with pathophysiologic mechanisms for disease. And one of the worrisome things with asthma and with particulate matter is that we're pretty sure we are getting airway remodeling, and that airway remodeling probably lasts for life. And that's one of my big concerns as a pediatric pulmonologist. I really believe that if we are not protecting children from air pollution, we're creating the next generation of pulmonary cripples. We used to think of asthma as a disease that you wheezed, you took an inhaler, you got better. We realize now that it's a chronic disease, and even if your lung function is pretty good, you have this lung remodeling from these pathways. And so from these studies, we know that, again, you have increased vascular and airway reactivity. You have enhanced thrombosis and coagulation. That probably accounts for increases in stroke and cardiovascular disease. You do get markers of increased systemic inflammation. And then there's a very interesting field looking at epigenetic mechanisms of disease, whereby particulate matter actually changes your DNA, causing methylation of certain sites and alterations in histones that regulate whether or not you turn a gene on or off. And so those events are events that stay with you for a while. And then finally, we do, most of our great data is from epidemiologic studies. And those are very good because they're real life. It's a period of time that you're subjected to it. It's real concentrations of whatever it is that is around your atmosphere. But they're non-specific, and they're certainly criticized for saying, look, you can't show that this isn't from the people smoking or having differences in their indoor atmosphere. There's a very low signal to noise ratio. It's hard to reproduce them. So when you look at some of the large studies like the Harvard 6 study, which went on for 20 years, it was criticized because really could not show that you had that grade of noise. Yet it was a very well done study. And then, of course, coming up with attributable causation to that particular particle causing the disease that is your endpoint. But there are both long-term and short-term studies. Some of the better short-term studies that have come out recently were around Beijing, around the Olympics, and looking at differences in a period of time before they cleaned up the air for the Olympics, during the Olympics, and after. From our short-term exposure to particulate matter, we have been able to show that there are increased ER visits and hospitalization for ischemic heart disease, strokes, asthma attacks, COPD, and infections. Long-term exposure to things that people look at are early mortality, COPD, asthma, and lung cancer. As far as childhood lung disease, which is what I want to spend the rest of the time talking about, children are at particular risk from air pollution, and that's for several reasons. Number one, They probably are getting exposed to particulate matter in events that are occurring prenatally. And we'll talk about some of the data that shows that there's actually decreases in birth weight, increases in childhood lung disease if the moms are exposed to particulate matter. Certainly with postnatal events, the younger you are when you're getting exposed to particulate matter, the worse your health. Children breathe more per pound. They are more active. They're closer to the ground, so the concentration of particulate matter down here is actually higher than it is up here. They have a lot more indoor activity, which again in some of the third world countries is huge because that's where some of the greater concentrations of particulate matter is. And then again, a early exposed lung is perhaps a remodeled lung, and that remodeled lung is going to cause disease for decades. Again, looking at prenatal exposure, there is fairly good data that there are increased numbers of stillbirths, preterm births, and low birth weight. There's data that you have decreased lung volumes if your mom is exposed to high levels of particulate matter, and increased rates of bronchiolitis and lower respiratory tract infections. And the pathophysiologic mechanism, again, for this is that the moms get exposed to the particulate matter that exposes the placenta, which causes endothelial cell dysfunction, and then compromises the infant because of the placental effects and release of inflammatory mediators across the placenta. This is data out of an article by Bruce et al. That came out 2 years ago doing a meta-analysis of the fetal effects and looked at, in this case, 4 different studies that showed about a 20 to 30% risk of increased stillborns in moms who are exposed to high levels of indoor pollution. The same study looked at 9 articles and doing a meta-analysis and showed that there's about a 50% increase in incidence of low birth weight, less than 250 grams. These studies were out of Israel, Guatemala, Zimbabwe, the Gaza Strip, and India, and all pretty much show the same thing. Interestingly, this article came out of British Columbia, where investigators looked at births that occurred between the years 1999 and 2000, and looked at 37 births, and then followed those kids out till they were 5 years of age. And they compared what happened with those kids wheezing at an early age in relationship to the particulate matter and other air pollutants that they were exposed to. And interestingly, there was a much greater risk of developing wheezing under the age of 5 if your intrauterine exposure to particulate matter was high, compared to that if the children that got exposed to greater levels after birth. And so again, there's fairly good data that exposing a mom to particulate matter in utero or when she's pregnant is going to affect her child for years to come. There's so much data out there on the fact that particulate matter increases asthma incidence and severity. It's really hard to summarize. And I think it's obvious to anybody who practices in the area that our number of ER visits, the number of hospitalizations go up in August, September. Unfortunately, this year, I'm still seeing kids coming down from Libya where they still are fighting forest fires. Last week, I had 8 kids in my office, and of those, 3 of them were from Libya, and each of them was having trouble because of the smoke in the air. This is an interesting study done by Clark out of Great Britain. It took children that were not diagnosed with asthma, but lived in the city outside of London, induced sputum, and then developed a scoring method for the amount of black carbon that you could find in the microplasmas. And from that scoring system, then could determine if they had a little bit, a lot, or a medium amount of particulate matter within their airways, and then related that to changes in lung function. And what he found that there was as you went up for median carbon exposure of about 1 microgram per meter squared, you had a drop in your FEV1 of 17%, and a drop in your forced vital capacity of about 12%. And again, these were non-asthmatic children, but could show at least a dose response between particulate matter and airway function. But also not terribly hopeless. This is a study that came out this year in New England Journal that I found really interesting, that showed basically that if we improve air quality, we can decrease asthma symptoms in kids. This study was done out of Los Angeles in 5 communities, and if you know anything about Los Angeles, you know it kind of sits up against the mountains, and so those communities tend to get worsening air quality late in the day, especially towards the backside of mountains. So some of your communities really are not too terribly bad. For example, if you look at Long Beach, it's out close to the ocean, and air quality tends to be a little bit better. Whereas if you look at Upland or Riverside, those cities tend to have higher levels of air pollution. So each of these lines represents a different city of those. Long Beach, Maricopa, Riverside, San Dominguez, or Upland, and each of these boxes depicts a different component of air pollution. And these lines depict that over the last several decades, they have had improvements in their air quality in many of those, although over the last 5 years, one could say there hasn't been much change, perhaps an increase in some levels of things like ozone. Each of these bars is a different cohort of patients, and each of those cohorts is over 2,000 patients. And within each of those cohorts, they studied their pulmonary function test over a 5-year period, and then compared that lung function within those periods of time. So you had one group of kids that were between 11 and 15 in those years, another group here, another group there, and those kids represented each of those cities. So I know it's a little complicated, but what they found was that over time, within each one of those communities, as air quality got better, lung function improved. So this is a different cohort, but studied early on when the air pollution was bad, compared to a different cohort in the same city studied at a later period of time when air quality was better. And there was a very tight link between improvements in nitric oxide, PM2.5 and PM10, to improvements in lung function. This graph is looking at forced vital capacity. Same thing was seen if they looked at FEV1 over the first second. And then when they looked at it in terms of the number of kids within each of those cohorts that had severe lung disease, over time they found decreases in kids that had, in this case, an FEV1 less than 90% predicted. So this cohort C had these percentages, a smaller percentage that had very bad lung function, but over time they improved. Cohort E was one of the later ones, and as you can see, since those kids were studied at later periods of time, their lung function improved as you improve air quality. And then finally, we know that particulate matter leads to increases in respiratory tract infections, both upper and lower. It used to be that our concepts of disease were that you could have something that hurts you because of your environment, such as asthma or COPD, or infectious diseases. Our concept now is that there's a lot of interplay between those, and that your environment actually determines your rate of getting infectious diseases. Some of the mechanisms for that happening, we know that air pollution causes decreases in mucociliary clearance. It causes epithelial cell inflammation, causes altered macrophage function, and again, does cause changes in your epigenetics. Interestingly, when we look at what your human biome is along the airways, we've been able to document changes in your carriage rate of some pathogens. Interestingly, smokers tend to carry more meningococcus than non-smokers do. We've also been able to document increased rates of strep pneumoniae and H. flu in children that are exposed to particulate matter, and increases in both lower and upper respiratory tract infections. In fact, the work again out of the Respire study group out of Guatemala has looked at the rates of pneumonia in kids in different environments. And there's a huge increase in the rate of pneumonia in kids that are subjected to smoke from indoor cooking. In their study in Guatemala, it was actually an incidence rate of 0.5 per patient year. So that meant that every other kid would get a very bad pneumonia within any 1 year period of time. So, what can we do as health professionals? Well, number one, decrease exposure. And I think that some of the things that you can advise your patients to do is, number one, know if you are at risk. So if you have asthma, if you have COPD, if you're pregnant, make sure that they know how to find your quality data. And any of these websites up here are very usable. Some of them are easy to remember, like airnow.gov, or just Googling Montana air quality, looking what the air quality for that day is. On those days, you should encourage them to avoid high pollution areas, such as being close to roadsides. And sometimes it's important to stay inside late in the day when the levels of pollutants are higher. And then they should avoid exertion, and you all know that. We cancel practices in August and September for football games. But as you're outside and you're breathing deeper and heavier, you expose yourself to greater concentrations. We recommend that those patients stay indoors. And as far as level of prevention, these are the things that can help in level of importance. Air conditioning with a filter helps. Probably helps more with a large particulate matter than it does small. A central air conditioner and heating unit with a treated filter helps, perhaps not as much as air conditioning. Perhaps the most effective thing you can do indoors is a HEPA filter that will help clean the air of smaller particulate matter. Unfortunately, those are very room volume specific, so a small one's not going to do the whole house. And most of my asthmatic patients that are having trouble, I make sure the parents put one in the room. Of course, we can clean up indoor air pollution by decreasing tobacco use. There's more and more data that is being generated as to what happens when you're not burning wood properly. And just to put a plug in, we are doing a study here within Montana and other areas of children that are in wood burning stoves. Now there's some flyers back there if you're interested. The parents do get recruited, do have some incentive for it. But probably the way that we burn wood and whether or not we're using proper stoves and EPA rated stoves makes a big difference. Masks and respirators probably don't help that much, especially with small particulate matter, unless you're not really get a true gas mask. So, many of the images that you see in China with people wearing the designer masks probably are ineffective other than for really large soot particles. The trouble with those recommendations is that for most part, our indoor air equals our outdoor air. And so if you're really going to do this and have any effect, you have to keep the doors and windows closed. Well, that's hard to do. The other thing that happens is with indoor air, you do have resuspension of particulate matter, and you also have some biochemical changes in that particulate matter with time on surface areas. So really key is, yes, keeping your indoor air environment clean, but it may not be as effective as we would like with outdoor smoky air. We really are going to have to clean up outdoor air for it to be of huge benefit to our population. We need to provide local healthy spaces for kids. Next, areas away from roads. We need to pay attention to where we're building our schools. Right now, there is estimated to be over 70,000 schools that are within 5 miles of a power plant. Certainly inner city schools that are built close to highways, there's a huge concern that we're exposing our children to unhealthy air in their school systems. We need to get involved locally and help with our community planning to do things like we've done here in Missoula, increasing bike lanes, making buses free, helping industry try and decrease their rates of exposure of particulate matter. And then I think we as physicians need to become active on a national basis. I think we need to help promote public health that really believes that clean air is important. As Roger Boulder described it, developing a natural culture of health. And realizing that these are important things and that small things that we do are going to affect our children for years to come. We need to see clean air as a human rights act and not something that we give up and then try and take back only after we prove them harm. And then finally, we have to recognize that there are social and economic inequities, that our poorer children and poorer populations in third world countries are the ones that are being subjected to this the most and can least afford it. So on a lighter note, we've talked a lot today about how smoke can increase colds sometimes in the state of Montana. Cold smoke's not a bad thing. I'm happy to take any questions that you have.
We want to avoid exertion unless we're the Grizz football team on ESPN. That's got to be one of the worst days I've ever seen in Missoula for, short-term exposure with a large number of people. That stadium was packed that day. What was the result of that as far as overall impression for emergency room visits? Or
I haven't heard, quite honestly. And one would wonder not just about the outdoor air, but having that larger population together and then driving all those cars into one area. I bet it was tremendous. I luckily or unluckily was out of town, but I've not heard any data specifically from that today.
You had mentioned that there's a change in the characteristic types of organisms. What does that have to do with besides ciliary and canal function? Is there anything else that you can think of?
Yeah, there's two things that probably lead to that. Number one is that inflammation locally, and that inflammation is probably setting you up for retention of some of those organisms. And at least the theories that I've read are that when you have overgrowth of some organisms, you probably notice a whole lot better than I do, you have suppression of your normal biome. And that normal biome helps you fight bad infections. So that was the going thought with the change in what's happening to your actual population of your upper airway. Do you have anything to add to that?
No, not really. I was just curious as to your thoughts on it. You do see that. That's why we see people who have chronic diseases colonized with Pseudomonas and other organisms as well. It's still not quite clear how that is chosen, but why don't we see like a more citrobacter resistant fibrosis?
You sort of spoke to this a little bit already, but could you add anything with regard to short or long-term impacts on people with no underlying lung disease whatsoever? Because it's something that comes up certainly every year during smoke season, and I know, just speaking with I'm one of the family medicine residents, and speaking with other residents, there was a fair amount of talk about everyone should avoid being outside at all when it's just polluted, which is not super realistic for 3 or 4 weeks at a time.
Yeah, I think it's a huge issue, and it is an area of at least epidemiologic research. And again, short term, we know that on days like that, people that, as you mentioned, that have pre-existing conditions are increased risk. That includes people with cardiovascular disease and strokes, not just pulmonary diseases. We do know that if you take a normal person and expose them to a room with forest fire smoke or wood-generated smoke or diesel fuel, you see immediate changes in vascular reactivity, changes in brachial artery distensibility. You see changes in airway function. As far as whether or not those things accumulate over a long period of time, say weeks instead of an hour or 2 days. Again, some of that data that we showed, the children that I illustrated with the study out of Los Angeles, for the most part, those children did not have asthma. And likewise, the kids that we talked about that had the carbon macrophages, those 64 kids, none of them had asthma. And yet, because of accumulating carbon within their airways, they had changes in lung function. And I'm not sure that there's a great answer when we have weeks of forest fires here. Other than trying to prevent and decrease your own exposure to it. Certainly there is a concern that the longer you stay indoors as a child, the worse your health is, because then you're not active. And that impacts on cardiovascular disease. So that's where I come back to, we have to try and provide healthy spaces for those children. Whether it's a green park that's further up in Rattlesnake and outside of the air stagnation zone, or indoor activities where we've got good air conditioning. And that harkens back to the effects of poverty. It's easy for me to say stay indoors where your air conditioner is. Well, if you can't afford an air conditioner and the extra electricity, that's not really a practical solution.
And then with regards to long-term effects, that's something where the jury is sort of still out. If you look at the vascular reactivity or carbon macrophages a year post-exposure, without re-exposure.
Right. Certainly it's a continuum. I don't think I've seen any studies that have said if you lived in backwoods Canada where you're not exposed to anything, came to Missoula for August and September, did it do anything to you next year? I don't think I've seen any of that. Certainly the longer you're exposed to things, and this is pretty clearly illustrated in the literature, the greater your risk of developing cancer, lung disease, asthma. And again, if you're interested in that type of data, look up the Harvard 6 Cities study. And that was a fascinating group of studies, actually, that started in the early 1990s and then was extended out and looked at increases in so if you have a quick second, these are the 6 studies they looked at, or 6 cities: Steubenville, which had very bad air pollution, St. Louis, Harriman, Waterton, Topeka, Kansas, and Portage, Wisconsin. And this is the rate, probability of survival over a 16-year period. And the relationship between the cities that had the worst air pollution, down here in black, and the better air quality up there in white, were dramatic. And their estimates over a 20-year period of time was there was about a 12% difference in mortality over that period of time from the dirtiest city to the cleanest city. And the things that the people were dying of most commonly were cardiovascular diseases, but there was an increased incidence in cancer and COPD. But again, that's a long-term study, and those are often criticized for the signal-to-noise ratio that you have. And while these are significant data, it's not huge. It's not 50%. It's 12%. So it's a continuum. I'm afraid I don't have a clearer answer for you than that. Okay.
Has anybody factored in altitude, and the altitude you were, say, born in, lived through in your younger years? Thinking of the area where the smoke forest was from the Butte area. I grew up there, and I just was rereading Into Thin Air by John Krakauer about the disasters on Everest, and thinking about the Sherpa culture, and they lived at such a high altitude. Is that factored into any of your studies?
I haven't seen that factored in at all. In the Respire study, which is one of the larger ones in Guatemala, those populations are living about 10 to 12,000 feet. But I've not seen them say, well, let's take the same level of indoor smoke exposure, compare the low ones to the high ones. I've not seen that done. Great. Thank you all for your attention and questions.